The day Susan Yates buried her second husband, she told the preacher she was done with God's cruelest joke, and she meant every word of it. The year was 1878, and the Oklahoma Territory was no place for a woman who had run out of patience with the universe. The prairie stretched in every direction like a brown and gold sea, indifferent to grief, indifferent to hunger, indifferent to the particular kind of loneliness that settled into a woman's bones when she had watched two men she loved get lowered into the same hard-packed earth. Susan stood at the grave of Thomas Yates, her second husband, a good man who had been thrown from a spooked horse 3 weeks prior and broken his neck on the unforgiving ground of their small homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas. She did not cry at the graveside. She had used up every tear she owned burying her first husband, Robert Calloway, 4 years earlier during a cholera outbreak that swept through the region like a merciless wind. The preacher said something about God's plan. Susan thanked him politely, turned around, and walked back to the house that felt too big for one person and 2 goats. She was 28 years old. She was tired in a way that sleep could not touch. And she had absolutely no intention of ever opening her heart to another human being for as long as she lived. The homestead was 16 acres of decent farmland, a small vegetable garden that was barely hanging on through the dry summer, a well that ran shallow in August, a barn with a leaking roof, and a small 2-room house that Thomas had built with his own hands when they married 3 years ago. It was hers now, all of it. The deed was in her name because Thomas had done that much for her before he died, perhaps sensing some premonition that men in this part of the world did not last long enough to make long-term plans. Susan was not the kind of woman who needed rescuing. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a school teacher and a farmer, and she had learned early that the land did not care whether you were a man or a woman. You worked it or you starved. She had been working since she could walk, and she had no intention of stopping just because she was alone again. But alone was hard, especially in 1878 in the Oklahoma Territory, where a woman without a husband was viewed by some men as either a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. It was the first week of September when Daniel Vaughn rode into her life, and he did not do it gracefully. He came down the road from Caldwell at a pace that suggested either urgency or stupidity, his horse kicking up a rooster tail of dust that Susan could see from half a mile away, while she was fixing the fence line along the east edge of her property. She watched him come with the wariness that had become second nature to her. Strange men on fast horses were rarely bringing good news out here. He slowed when he reached the gate, which was hanging crooked on its hinges, one of about 40 things on the property that needed fixing. He pulled his horse up and looked at the gate, then looked at her, then looked at the gate again as if calculating whether he should open it or just wait. "Gate opens to the left," Susan called out, not because she was being helpful but because she could see he was about to make the mistake of pulling it to the right and likely tear the whole sorry thing off its post. He looked at her again. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain canvas coat that was dusty from the road and a hat that had seen better years. He had dark hair that curled just slightly at the edges where sweat had dampened it, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than most men were made of. "Thank you," he said, and opened the gate correctly. He rode in and stopped his horse about 10 feet from her, which she appreciated because some men rode right up to you like the space between people did not matter. He looked down at her from the saddle with eyes that were an unusual shade, somewhere between gray and green, like the sky before a storm makes up its mind what kind of storm it wants to be. "I am looking for the Yates property," he said. "You found it. Are you Susan Yates? Depends on who is asking and what they want." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out to her. She crossed to him and took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a letter from the Caldwell Land Office, formal and stiff in its language, informing her that there was a matter regarding the water rights on her eastern boundary that needed to be discussed with the adjacent landowner. The adjacent landowner had appointed one Daniel Vaughn as his representative. She folded the letter and handed it back to him. "Thomas Yates is dead," she said plainly. "Has been for 3 weeks. Whatever your employer wants to discuss, he will need to discuss it with me." Something moved across Daniel Vaughn's face. It was not quite sympathy and not quite discomfort, but it was somewhere in between, and it looked genuine rather than practiced. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and those 4 words carried a weight that told her he knew what loss felt like from the inside. "Thank you," she said. "Now what does Harlan Briggs want with my water rights?" Because Harlan Briggs was the adjacent landowner, and Susan knew the name well enough to not like it. Harlan Briggs owned 400 acres to her east and had a reputation in Caldwell for being the kind of man who collected land the way other men collected debts, always looking for the angle, always looking for the edge. Daniel Vaughn climbed down from his horse in a single easy motion, which told her he had been riding since before he could fully remember learning how. He held his hat in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was direct without being aggressive, which was rare enough in a man that it caught her attention. "Mr. Briggs believes the creek that runs along your eastern boundary belongs to him by right of the original land grant from 1872, Daniel said. "He sent me to discuss the matter before taking it to a judge." "The creek runs through my property," Susan said. "It has for 3 years. Thomas checked the survey when we bought the land." "I know. I looked at the survey myself before I rode out here." He paused. "I think Mr. Briggs is wrong." That surprised her. She looked at him more carefully. "Then why are you here representing him?" "Because he pays me to ride where he tells me to ride and have conversations he does not want to have himself. He did not ask me what I thought of his legal standing. He said it without bitterness, just matter-of-factly. But since you asked, I believe if you take the original survey to a judge, you will win. The creek crosses 1/3 of a mile inside your eastern boundary before it hits Briggs' land. The man has no case." Susan studied him for a long moment. "You are a very strange representative." "I have been told," he said simply. "What does Harlan Briggs actually want? Not the legal version. What does he want?" Daniel Vaughn was quiet for a moment, which she respected because it meant he was choosing his words honestly rather than quickly. "He wants the land," he said finally. "He has wanted it since your husband bought it. The creek makes it more valuable for grazing in the dry months. He thought with Thomas gone you might be persuaded to sell." "I am not," Susan said. "I know that now," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Go back and tell Harlan Briggs that if he sends anyone onto my property or makes any more claims against my water rights, I will be in front of Judge Whitmore in Caldwell before he can get his boots on in the morning. I will tell him." He put his hat back on his head. "Mrs. Yates, I want you to know that I did not come out here to threaten you or to pressure you. I came out here because Briggs sent me and because I thought it was better that you heard it from someone who would be straight with you rather than from someone who would not." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Have you eaten today?" It was a practical question, not a kind one. She told herself that as she said it. He was a man who had ridden 8 miles from Caldwell in the September heat on the business of a man she did not trust, and feeding people who came to your door was simply what decent people did in this part of the country. It had nothing to do with those storm-colored eyes or the way he held his hat like he was being careful with it. "No," he admitted. "I left early. I have soup on the stove," she said, and turned toward the house. "You can tie your horse at the post." She did not look back to see if he followed. She already knew he would. The kitchen was small and smelled of wood smoke and the wild onions she had put in the soup that morning. She ladled out a bowl for him and set bread on the table, the kind of bread she made twice a week because Thomas had liked it, and because old habits were harder to kill than people. She stood at the counter while he sat at the table, because sitting across from a strange man in her kitchen felt like more than she was ready for. He ate without rushing and without making a show of how hungry he was, which she appreciated. He looked around the kitchen with eyes that noticed things without making her feel examined. "Did your husband build this?" he asked. He did. He built it well. He was a good man, she said, and that was all she was going to say about Thomas Yates to a stranger. Daniel Vaughn finished his soup and stood and thanked her in a way that meant it, not in the way men thanked women for food as if it were simply owed to them. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the edge of the table. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "if Briggs gives you any trouble, you have every legal right to hold your ground. But if you find yourself needing to navigate any of the paperwork or dealings with the land office, there is a good lawyer in Caldwell named Elliot Marsh. He will not steal from you." "I know Elliot Marsh," she said. "He drew up our deed." "Then you are already ahead of most people." He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame. "I am sorry about your husband, and I am sorry that Briggs sent me out here to add to your troubles." "You did not add to them," she said, and it was true. He had been, as he had said, straight with her. He left, and she watched him ride back down the road toward Caldwell through the small window above the kitchen sink, and she told herself that she was watching to make sure he actually left rather than for any other reason. She was mostly able to believe that. 3 days later, the fence along the eastern boundary was cut, not in the careless way that might happen from wind or a wandering animal. It was cut deliberately, in 3 places, along the section that ran closest to the creek. Susan discovered it in the early morning when she went to check on the 2 milk goats and found the fence open and the animals on the wrong side of it, grazing contentedly on the dry grass near the creek bank. She spent an hour getting the goats back and another 2 hours repairing the fence with wire and pliers and language that would have made her schoolteacher mother cover her ears. She was hot and furious, and convinced that Harlan Briggs had just made his opening move. She drove the wagon into Caldwell the next morning and went to see Elliot Marsh, who listened to her with the careful attention of a man who understood that frontier law was less about justice and more about who could prove what to whom in a county where judges rode circuit and were not always in town when you needed them. "You need documentation," Elliot said. "Get the original survey out and have someone witness the current fence line against it. If the fence runs where the deed says it should, then any tampering is clearly on your property. And Briggs," Elliot tapped his fingers on the desk, "Harlan Briggs is a powerful man in this county, Susan. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But he is not above the law, and he knows that." She left Elliot's office and was crossing the main street of Caldwell, a street that was loud with the business of a cattle town in full operation, drovers and merchants and freighters, and the general noise of a community that lived and died by the cattle trade, when she nearly walked directly into Daniel Vaughn. He caught her by the arm to stop them both from colliding, a reflexive thing, and let go immediately once she had steadied. "Mrs. Yates," he said. "Mr. Vaughn." They stood in the middle of the boardwalk while people moved around them. She noticed he was not wearing the canvas coat today but a darker shirt, and he had shaved, which for no particular reason she noticed. "Your fence was cut," she said. "It was not a question." He looked at her steadily. "I heard. I want you to know that I did not know that was going to happen. I did not think you cut it yourself. Briggs has 2 men working his ranch who are not the kind of men I am comfortable being associated with," Daniel said, and his voice was careful and low. "I told him 3 days ago that you would not sell and that your water rights were legally sound. I do not know what he told those men to do. He told them to cut my fence." "Yes." The word came out of him like it cost him something. "I think so." She looked at him directly. "Are you still working for Briggs?" A pause. "I gave him my notice this morning." That surprised her enough that she took a moment before responding. "Why?" "Because I am not comfortable with what he is doing," Daniel said simply. "And because I rode out to your property 3 days ago and told you that you had legal standing and that you should hold your ground, and then the fence got cut. I will not be party to that." She studied him. He was steady under her gaze, not defensive, not posturing. Just honest, the way some men were honest because they did not know how to be anything else. "What will you do?" she asked. "I have been looking at a piece of land south of town," he said. "I have been in this area for a year working for wages. I am 31 years old, and it is time I stopped working for other men and started working for myself." She did not know what to say to that, so she said, "Good luck to you, Mr. Vaughn," and moved past him toward her wagon. She told herself she was not thinking about him on the ride home. The prairie was wide and golden, and the sky was enormous and blue, and there was plenty to look at that had nothing to do with a tall man with storm-colored eyes who had given up his income because of something that had happened to her fence. But she was thinking about him. She was honest enough with herself to admit that, even if she immediately followed the thought with a firm and absolute resolve that it did not matter, she was not built for this again. She had decided that at Thomas's grave. She had decided it even more firmly at Robert Calloway's grave 4 years before that. She was a woman who had been broken open twice by love and grief together, and she had put herself back together twice, and she was not sure she had enough pieces left for a third attempt. The autumn came in warm and then cold, the way it always did in Kansas, without much warning or apology. Susan harvested what was left of her garden and put up vegetables for the winter, repaired the barn roof with the help of her neighbor Mrs. Clara Hutchins, whose husband had gone to Wichita for supplies and taken longer than expected to come back. Clara was 53 and had lived in Kansas since before it was a state, and she knew more about surviving than most men Susan had ever met. They worked side by side on the barn roof for 2 days, and Susan was grateful for the company even if she would not have said so out loud. "Harlan Briggs has been in the saloon telling people your land is as good as his," Clara mentioned on the second afternoon, handing up a shingle from the ladder. "Harlan Briggs can say whatever he likes in the saloon," Susan said. "His men have been riding along your fence line. I know, I have seen them." She hammered the shingle into place. "I am not afraid of Harlan Briggs. I know you are not, sweetheart, but sometimes being right and being unafraid is not quite enough in this part of the world." Clara handed up another shingle. "People are saying that young man who used to work for him came back through town last week." Susan kept her eyes on the roof. "Is that so? Bought himself that piece of land south of town, the Henderson claim that went bust last spring." Clara's voice was carefully neutral, which meant she was paying close attention. "Seems like he is planning to stay. He told me he was looking at a piece of land when I ran into him in town," Susan said. "Did he?" "Clara, I am just passing along information. You are doing considerably more than that." Clara laughed, a warm and genuine sound that made the prairie feel less enormous. "I have known you for 2 years, Susan Yates, and I have watched you hold yourself together through things that would have flattened most people. I am not suggesting anything. I am merely noting that a man who gives up a paying position because something wrong happened to a woman he barely knows is not a common kind of man." Susan said nothing. She hammered another shingle. "The thing about living alone on 16 acres in 1878 was that it gave you a great deal of time to think and very few ways to stop thinking. The evenings were the hardest. During the day there was always something to do, always some fence or roof or garden bed or animal demanding attention. But in the evenings, after the sun went down and the coyotes started their distant conversation with each other across the dark prairie, the house became very quiet and very empty in a way that Susan had learned to endure rather than enjoy. She read. She had a small collection of books, mostly practical things, a few novels she had carried from Missouri, a Bible she kept on the shelf more out of habit than conviction. She sewed. She wrote letters to her sister Mary in St. Louis that she sent whenever the mail rider came through, which was not as often as it should have been. She did not write anything about Daniel Vaughn because there was nothing to write. She had met a man twice. He had been decent to her. That was not a story. It became a story in the second week of October. She was coming back from the creek with 2 full pails of water when she saw smoke on the eastern horizon, thick and black and rolling, and she set the pails down and stared at it for long enough to realize it was coming from the direction of her neighbor James Proctor's homestead. She left the water pails and ran back to the house for her rifle, not because she expected to shoot anything, but because it was a frontier habit, and then she got the horse saddled and rode hard toward the smoke. By the time she arrived, the Proctor barn was fully involved, flames 30 feet high, the heat pushing her back even at a distance of 50 yards. James Proctor was standing in the yard watching it with the hollow expression of a man who could not fully process what his eyes were telling him. His wife Alice was sitting on the ground with her 2 children, both small, pressed against her. Susan dismounted and went to Alice first. "Is everyone out?" "Yes, all of us out." Alice's voice was flat with shock. "James got the horses out of the barn before it went up fully." "How did it start?" Alice looked at her and then looked away, and that look was answer enough. Barns did not simply ignite in October. The air was cool and damp from 2 days of rain. James Proctor came over. He was 40 and heavily built and looked 10 years older than that right now. "Briggs's men," he said quietly. "I saw them ride off south. I know those horses." Susan felt something cold settle in her chest. "James." "He wants my water access too," James said. "The Proctor spring runs under my south field and surfaces near his fence line. He has been after it for a year." Susan looked at the burning barn and thought about her cut fence, and thought about the way Harlan Briggs sat in his big house 400 acres wide, and decided what belonged to him regardless of what any deed or law said about it. She thought about what Clara had said, that sometimes being right and being unafraid was not enough. She helped James and Alice salvage what they could from the outbuildings that the fire had not yet reached. She stayed until the barn had burned down to its frame, and there was nothing left to do but look at the ruins. It was dusk by then, the sky going orange and purple, and she was riding back toward her own property when she saw the rider coming toward her along the road. She recognized him by the way he sat in the saddle before she could make out his face in the failing light. Daniel Vaughn pulled up alongside her and looked at the smoke still rising in the distance. "Proctor's barn." He said, "Yes." "Is everyone safe?" Physically, she looked at him. "Briggs's men." His jaw tightened. "I heard they rode out this way this afternoon. I came as soon as I heard." "You have your own land to worry about now," she said. "Yes, and it is adjacent to yours." He said it directly. "I am not going to pretend that does not make Briggs's behavior directly relevant to me." They rode together in silence for a quarter mile. The prairie was settling into its evening sounds, the insects and the distant birds and the wind through the dry grass. It was a sound that Susan had come to know as well as she knew her own breathing. "I am going to go to Judge Whitmore tomorrow," she said. "James Proctor will too. Briggs needs to understand that the law exists in this county." "I will go with you if you want," Daniel said. "I worked for Briggs for 8 months. I know his operations and I know his people. A judge might find that useful." She looked at him in the dimming light. "You would do that?" "Yes." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because it is right," he said, and there was nothing elaborate about it, no performance, no calculation. Just a man who had a clear sense of where the line was and had already decided which side of it he stood on. She did not ask him in for supper this time. She thanked him and said she would meet him in front of Elliot Marsh's office at 9 in the morning, and she rode on to her own house. But she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the lamp was lit, and she was aware of something uncomfortable happening in the region of her chest, something she recognized and did not want to recognize, like seeing a storm building on the horizon and knowing you cannot outride it. She was 31 years old. He was 31 years old. He was a decent man who had done the right thing twice now, when doing the right thing cost him something. And she was a woman who had buried 2 decent men, and had decided that she was done with the whole enterprise of loving people who the world might then remove from her. She pressed her palms flat on the table and sat very still in the lamplight and told herself, firmly and clearly, and with as much conviction as she could assemble, that she was not built for this again. The morning was cold and bright, the first real cold of the season, with frost on the grass that crunched underfoot when Susan walked from the house to the barn. She wore her good coat, the dark wool one that had been Mary's before Mary outgrew it, and sent it west with a letter that said she hoped it would keep Susan warm in ways their letters could not. She rode into Caldwell with her surveying documents and the original deed folded carefully in an oilskin pouch inside her coat. Daniel was already in front of Elliot Marsh's office when she arrived, and so was James Proctor, looking like he had not slept, which he probably had not. They spent an hour with Elliot going over documents and statements, and then they went together to the county courthouse to see Judge Whitmore. Franklin Whitmore was 64, gray-haired and possessed of a reputation for impatience with nonsense that Susan had always found reassuring. He listened to them with the focused attention of a man who had spent 30 years sorting genuine grievances from manufactured ones, and he asked sharp questions, and he looked at Daniel Vaughn with particular interest when Daniel laid out what he knew of Briggs's operations. "You worked for Briggs," the judge said. "Yes, sir, for 8 months. I resigned 10 days ago. Why? Because he sent me to pressure a widow into selling land she had legal right to, and then when she refused, someone cut her fence." Daniel said it plainly, with no oratorical flourish. "I was not willing to be associated with that." Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Susan, and then at James Proctor. "I cannot charge Briggs with burning a barn on the testimony that someone saw his men riding in the general direction before the fire, but I can issue a formal legal warning regarding the property disputes, which will create a documented record if anything further occurs. And I am going to have a personal conversation with Harlan Briggs that I suspect he will find unpleasant. It was not justice, exactly. It was the best available version of it in a county where the law moved slower than the men who broke it. But it was something, and all three of them understood that a judge's formal attention changed the calculation for a man like Briggs. They rode back from the courthouse in a loose group, and by the time they reached the edge of town, it was just Susan and Daniel, James Proctor having turned south toward his ruined barn and his wife and children, and the enormous practical work of deciding what to do next. "Thank you," Susan said when they were alone on the road. "You would have done the same without me," Daniel said, and he meant it as a fact rather than a compliment. "I would." But having someone who knew Briggs's operations made it more useful. He was quiet for a moment. The road stretched ahead of them between the brown autumn fields. A hawk was circling high above them, patient and remote, the way hawks always were. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "I realize this is forward of me, and I want you to know that you are entirely free to tell me it is none of my business, but I was wondering if you might share Sunday dinner with me this week. There is a decent restaurant in town, or we could arrange something else if you prefer." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. She had known this was coming in some form or another. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, by the particular feeling of the air. "Mr. Vaughn," she said carefully. "I know," he said, and his voice was quiet. "I know you have been through things I cannot imagine. I know you did not ask for any conversation of this kind, and if you would prefer I not bring it up again, I will not. I buried 2 husbands," she said flatly, because there was no gentle way to say it and gentleness felt dishonest right now. "I know. I am not built for it again." She said the words carefully. "The way you handle something you know is both true and cutting. I have decided that. I decided it clearly and deliberately, and I have not changed my mind." Daniel Vaughn was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply accept it and move the conversation elsewhere, which would have been both a relief and a disappointment that she would not have acknowledged. "I hear you," he said finally, "and I want to be honest with you in return because you have been honest with me, and that is the only currency I know how to trade in." He paused. "I am not asking you to do it again. I am not asking you to do what you did before, with the first time or the second time. I am asking for something entirely different from either of those things. I am asking for the first time. Not the second time, not the third. The first time this particular thing has ever existed because it has not existed before." She turned to look at him. He was riding with his eyes forward, not performing anything, just saying what was in him with the same direct simplicity he seemed to apply to everything. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I am not asking you to repeat something that hurt you," he said. "I am asking if you are willing to try something that has never happened before. Between you and me, exactly as we are, not as versions of other people or other tries, just this." He glanced at her then, and those storm-colored eyes were steady and unafraid. "Sunday dinner. That is all I am asking. Not a future, not a promise, not any of the things that have weight and consequence, just a meal." She looked at the road again. The hawk above them had tilted on a thermal and was gliding south, easy and effortless, the way everything looked from far enough above. She said, "Sunday dinner. Yes, that is all." "That is all," he agreed. She thought about the words he had just used, not the second time, the first time. As if what they were doing existed in its own category, unclouded by what had come before. It was the kind of reasoning that could be called foolish by a practical woman who had learned not to trust the future. But it was also the kind of reasoning that was, in its own way, simply honest. "Sunday," she said. He did not smile like he had won something. He nodded like they had reached an agreement, which was exactly what it was. She went home and sat in the kitchen and told herself very firmly that a Sunday dinner was not a love story. It was a meal with a neighbor who had been decent to her, and who had good sense and storm-colored eyes, and who had said something about first times that she was going to stop thinking about right now. She thought about it for the rest of the week. Sunday came in gray and cool, the sky low and pressing. Susan wore her good dress, which was dark blue with small white buttons at the collar, and she felt slightly ridiculous for carrying what she wore to a meal that was just a meal, and she wore it anyway. The restaurant in Caldwell was called Hartley's, and it was a clean establishment run by a woman named Martha Hartley who had come from Ohio, and who made a beef stew that people drove into town specifically to eat. Susan and Daniel sat across from each other at a table near the window, and the first 10 minutes were the slightly awkward business of two private people deciding how much of themselves to offer up to each other. He had grown up in Virginia, she learned. He was the son of a farmer who had lost his land after the war, when Daniel was 13 years old, and the family had scattered like seeds in a wind, each one landing somewhere different. He had been out west since he was 19, moving from cattle work to ranch managing to the kind of general frontier employment that a capable man could always find if he was willing to ride wherever the work took him. "Do you have family?" she asked. "A brother in Colorado, a sister in Texas." "My parents are gone." He said the last part the same way she always said Thomas is dead, as a fact rather than a wound, which meant it was a wound that had been absorbed into the daily architecture of living. "I have a sister in St. Louis," she said. "Mary. She writes me letters and worries about me in a very active and specific way." "Does she know about Briggs?" "She knows there is a land dispute. I left out the fence gutting and the barn fire because Mary would be on the next train to Kansas, and she would arrive here with opinions that Harlan Briggs is not ready for." He smiled at that, a real smile that changed his face in a way she had not seen before, warming it up from its usual composed steadiness. It was the kind of smile that came rarely enough to mean something. They ate and talked for 2 hours, and Susan noticed that he listened the way few people listened, with complete attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually following what she said and connecting it to what came next. He asked about her garden and was genuinely interested in her answer, not making conversation but actually curious about how she managed the soil and what she grew and what the dry summer had cost her. When they stepped outside into the gray October afternoon, the air was sharp and clean and smelled of coming rain. "Thank you," Daniel said. "For what?" "For Sunday dinner." His voice was level and warm. "I enjoyed your company." "I enjoyed yours," she said, and it was true, and admitting it felt like stepping onto ice and finding it solid under her weight. He walked her to where she had tied her horse and helped her mount, not in a patronizing way, but the way you help someone because the saddle was high and it was simply practical. He stepped back and touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "if you would ever like to do this again, I would be glad of it." She looked down at him from the saddle. The gray sky was pressing down behind him, and the street was busy with the afternoon business of the town. "I might," she said, and rode home. The winter settled over the Kansas prairie in December with a seriousness that the autumn had only been hinting at. Snow came and stayed, and the world contracted to the distance a person could walk in heavy boots without freezing, and Susan's world became the house and the barn and the path between them, beaten into the snow by daily repetition. But something had changed, something she could not quite name and was cautious about examining too closely. Daniel Vaughn had come to Sunday dinner at Hartley's 3 more times through November. Each time it had been comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when two people have decided, without discussing it explicitly, that they are not going to make demands of each other or rush toward anything. They talked. They ate. They walked sometimes along the main street of Caldwell in the cold afternoon air. He made her laugh twice, which surprised her both times, because she had not realized she had missed the particular physical relief of genuine laughter until she experienced it again. He had come out to her property twice to help with things she had not asked for help with. The first time it was the barn door that had been swelling and sticking in the autumn damp, and he fixed it in 20 minutes with a hand plane that he had brought in his saddlebag without being asked. The second time it was the fence on the western boundary, which had been sagging since summer, and he spent an afternoon resetting the posts while she worked in the garden close enough that they could talk without shouting, and far enough apart that it did not feel like more than it was. She cooked him dinner after the fence work, not in the careful way of a woman trying to impress, but in the practical way of two people who were both hungry and one of whom had food and a stove, and it was cold outside. They ate at the kitchen table, and this time she sat across from him instead of standing at the counter, which was a small thing and probably meant nothing. It might have meant something. In December, with the snow sealing the world into quiet and the days short and the evenings long, she found herself writing about him to Mary. Not in a way that declared anything, but in the way you mention someone whose presence you have been aware of consistently enough that omitting them from a letter starts to feel like lying. Mary's response came in January on a mail rider who looked like he had personally fought the winter to deliver it. Mary wrote, "I am glad you have a neighbor who is decent, and I am glad he makes you laugh, and I am going to say nothing else because I know you will figure out what I mean anyway and make your own decisions as you always do. But Susan, do not let fear disguise itself as wisdom. Those two things look similar from the outside and very different from the inside." Susan read the letter 3 times and then set it on the kitchen shelf where it stayed for a week before she folded it and put it away. Do not let fear disguise itself as wisdom. She was wise. She had been made wise by hard things, but she was also aware, in the honest part of herself that she did not always give enough air to, that she was afraid. Not of Daniel Vaughn specifically, but of the weight of caring for someone again. Of the specific vulnerability of needing someone's presence in a way that meant their absence would hurt. She had been hurt enough. Was it foolish to avoid the risk of more? Or was it, as Mary suggested, fear calling itself something more respectable than what it was? She was still wrestling with this on the 3rd Sunday of February, when Daniel appeared at her door unannounced, which he had never done before. She opened the door, and he was standing on the step with his hat in his hands and snow on his shoulders, and an expression on his face that was different from his usual composed steadiness. He looked like a man who had decided something after a long time of deciding and was now standing at the edge of that decision. "I am sorry to come without notice," he said. "I need to tell you something." She stepped back from the door and let him in. He stood in the kitchen with his hat still in his hands and the snow melting off his coat and did not sit down. "Harlan Briggs has sold his land," Daniel said. She stared at him. "What? Sold it? Lock, stock, and barrel, the whole 400 acres. He is leaving the county. I heard it from Elliot Marsh this morning." Daniel's voice was careful. "The judge's conversation apparently had more effect than we thought. Briggs has been in legal difficulty in 2 other counties, and I think the formal record here was the final consideration. Susan sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. She felt something unknot in her chest that she had been carrying tightly since September, something she had not fully recognized as tension until it began to release. "It is over," she said. "The land threat is over, yes." He was watching her with that particular attention of his. "There is something else I wanted to tell you." She looked up at him. "I wanted to tell you that I have been out here for 6 months now," Daniel said, "and that the land I bought south of town is the first piece of ground that has ever been mine, and I am putting everything I have into making it work. And I wanted to tell you that the past 6 months have been the best I have had in years, and that you are the reason for a large part of that, and I think you should know it even if you choose to do nothing with the information." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. "Daniel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed. She could see that he noticed. "You do not have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I am not asking for anything in response. I only wanted to be honest with you, because that is the only thing I know how to be, and I thought you deserved honesty more than you deserved me pretending I felt nothing." "Down," she said. He sat. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment, then looked at him. "I told you in October that I was not built for this again. I remember. I meant it when I said it," she said. "I was not lying to you or to myself. I know. But I have been thinking about what you said that day, about the first time." She kept her voice level because this was important and she wanted to say it accurately. "You said you were not asking for the second time or the third time. You were asking for the first time, for the thing between us specifically that had not existed before." "Yes. I have been arguing with that logic for 4 months," Susan said. "I'm a practical woman. I know that a man's death is a man's death regardless of which iteration of love preceded it. I know that grief is grief and that the arithmetic of loss does not improve with context." She looked at him steadily. "But I also know that what I have felt in the past 4 months is not the same as what I felt before. Not worse and not better and not less or more deserving of care. Just genuinely different. And I think you were right that different matters." Daniel was very still across the table. "I am still afraid," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I am afraid of caring for someone and losing them. I am afraid of making myself that open again." "That is reasonable," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be unafraid. I'm only asking if you are willing to be open despite it." She looked at him. This man who had ridden out to her fence line and told her the truth when he did not have to. This man who had given up his income and testified before a judge and fixed her barn door and her fence and sat across from her at Sunday dinners and listened to everything she said like it mattered. This man with the storm-colored eyes who had said something about first times that she had been turning over in her hands for months like a stone that kept revealing new facets. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am willing to try." He did not reach across the table. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she did not have a precise word for, something that was relief and warmth and a careful sort of joy, the kind that knew it had to be tended rather than assumed. "I am glad," he said. "Do not make me regret saying it," she said, and there was a piece of humor in it but also a piece of genuine instruction. "I will do my best not to," he said simply, which was the right answer, because the right answer was never a promise you could not guarantee. The spring came slowly and then all at once, the way spring did in Kansas, with weeks of cold rain, and then suddenly the world was green and the meadowlarks were back, and the light was golden and long in the evenings. Susan planted her garden earlier than usual because the soil had wintered well, and she found herself doing the work with a lighter feeling than she had carried in years. She and Daniel saw each other regularly through the spring. Not every day, not even every week in the busy planting season, when both of them had land demanding full attention, but enough. Enough that she found herself listening for hoofbeats in the evenings with a recognition that was becoming habit, and enough that, When he was not there, the quiet of the homestead had a different character than it had had before, not lonelier but simply aware of an absence rather than simply blank. He had 40 acres of his own now, having purchased an additional 24 adjoining his original claim in the spring. He was building a proper barn to replace the temporary structure that had been on the land when he bought it, and he talked about cattle eventually, and possibly some grain on the northern part of his acreage. He talked about these things when they walked in the evenings along the creek that ran between their properties, the same creek that Harlan Briggs had once tried to claim, and Susan listened and added her own thoughts, and found that she had opinions about his cattle plans that she had not known she was going to have. In June, he held her hand for the first time. They had been walking along the creek in the long evening light, and she had stepped on a loose stone near the bank and stumbled slightly, and he had caught her hand, and then they had walked on and he had not let go and she had not taken her hand back. They walked like that for a quarter-mile without saying anything about it, two people who had decided something without needing to name it aloud. When she looked up at him, he was looking ahead at the path, and there was a small, quiet smile on his face that she thought he probably did not know was there. She did not say anything. She looked ahead, too, at the golden creek and the green prairie and the enormous Kansas sky, and she held his hand and thought that perhaps the thing about first times was that they felt different because they were different, because every new thing between two specific people was genuinely unprecedented regardless of what had come before. July brought heat and the hard work of maintaining the garden through the dry weeks, and August brought a county fair in Caldwell that Susan had not attended in 2 years. Daniel asked her if she would go with him, and she said yes, and they drove into town in his wagon, which was newer and more solid than hers, and they spent the day looking at livestock and produce and craft work and eating pie at the fair tables. Clara Hutchins found them at the pie table and looked at their arrangement with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. "You two look well," she said, with enormous emphasis on the word well. "We are fine, Clara," Susan said. "You are considerably more than fine," Clara said, and moved on with the bearing of a woman who has seen something she expected and is pleased by the confirmation. Daniel looked at Susan with a raised eyebrow. "She has been waiting for this since October," Susan explained. "Since October," he looked genuinely surprised. "That is longer than I was waiting." "When did you start waiting?" He thought about it. "September, when you told me the gate opened to the left." She laughed, and he looked at her laughing with the expression he sometimes had when she said or did something that appeared to please him beyond what the moment seemed to call for. They drove back to her homestead in the warm evening, and he walked her to her door, which was a thing he had not done before because they had never been out together in the evening that required walking to a door. She stood on the step, which put her nearly at eye level with him, which was something she had not anticipated and which changed the geography of the moment. He looked at her in the long summer dusk, the sky still holding its last light in bands of rose and gold behind him. "Susan," he said. "Yes." "May I kiss you?" It was so straightforward and so simple, and so much the kind of question only a man who had genuine respect for the answer would ask, that she felt something in her chest open up a little further in a way that was frightening and also not frightening at all, the two feelings coexisting in the particular way that real things are more complicated than their categories. "Yes," she said. He kissed her carefully and with warmth, his hands not grabbing at her but resting, one along her jaw and one briefly at her waist, and it was nothing like anything she had experienced before, not because it was elaborate or passionate in a dramatic way, but because it was specific to her and to him, and to this moment on this step in this particular summer dusk, and that specificity was its own kind of extraordinary. When they separated, she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she said, "Good night, Daniel," and he said, "Good night, Susan," and he walked to his wagon, and she went inside and stood in her kitchen with her back against the closed door. She pressed one hand flat over her heart, which was behaving entirely differently than it was supposed to when a woman had sworn off the whole enterprise. She was not afraid right now. She was going to be afraid later, probably tomorrow morning, when the practical daylight showed everything in its real dimensions again. But right now, she was just aware of being alive in a way that she had forgotten felt like anything specific, aware of the warmth of the evening and the sound of the crickets outside, and the particular quality of a heart that had been convinced it was done and had been, apparently, mistaken. She wrote to Mary that night, a long letter that said considerably more than her previous letters had, and when she sealed it she was smiling in a way she did not examine too carefully. The autumn of 1879 came around, and with it the anniversary of the day Daniel had first ridden through her gate. She noted the date privately and said nothing about it, and then was entirely unprepared for him to arrive on her doorstep that evening with a small wrapped package and the information that he had also been counting. "You counted," she said, looking at the package. "I am not embarrassed about it," he said. She opened the package. It was a small book, a collection of poems, the kind of thing that was difficult to acquire in Caldwell, which meant he had ordered it, which meant he had been thinking about ordering it for some time. She looked at the book and then at him. "You are a complicated man to have predicted," she told him. "Is that good or bad?" "It is extremely good," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He ate dinner with her that evening, and they sat afterward by the small fire in the sitting room, which was a thing they had not done before, the sitting together by firelight in the evening in the particular domestic intimacy of it. And Susan read him one of the poems from the book because he asked her to, and his voice when he said, "I like that one," was so quietly content that she had to look away at the fire for a moment to manage what she was feeling. He left at a proper hour, and she stood at the door watching his lantern sway down the road toward his own property, and she thought about the word love. She had not let herself think that word in connection with him, had been careful of it the way you are careful of a blade that cuts whether you intend it to or not. But standing in the night air with the sound of his horse fading into the dark, she found she could not quite maintain the avoidance any longer. She loved him. She loved him the way she had not quite loved before, not less than what she had felt for Thomas or Robert, but layered over it and through it, informed by it, built partly from the wreckage of it. She loved him in a way that was clear-eyed and afraid and decided all at the same time. She was still afraid. She thought perhaps she would always carry some measure of that particular fear, the fear of a woman who has learned that loving someone is also making yourself vulnerable to their absence. But Mary had been right that fear and wisdom were not the same thing, and she was wise enough now to know the difference. She went inside and sat down and thought about what she was going to do about this. She waited 2 weeks because she was not impulsive by nature and because some decisions deserved the dignity of being thought through properly. She thought about what she wanted, not what she feared or what made sense or what the world around her expected. What she actually wanted, in the way that a person who has been through enough hardship learns to be precise about what matters to them. What she wanted was Daniel Vaughn, his steadiness and his honesty and his storm-colored eyes and the way he listened, and the way he laughed on the rare occasions she made him laugh, and the way he had said she was the reason a large part of his good months had been good. She wanted the specificity of him. She invited him to Sunday dinner at her house, which was not unusual. But when he arrived and she had set the table and the food was ready, she did not sit down right away. She stood in the kitchen and looked at him standing there, comfortable in her space in the way he had become comfortable over these months, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her with full attention. He always gave full attention. "I love you," she said clearly. "I want you to know that. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just think you deserve to know it." He was very still for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the October wind moved through the dry grass. "Susan," he said, and his voice was different, lower and warmer, as if her name had changed character in his mouth. "You do not have to say," she started. "I love you," he said. I have loved you since before I had any right to think it, and I have been enormously careful about it because you told me you were not built for this again, and I was not willing to push anything you had not chosen for yourself. But yes, I love you." She looked at him across the kitchen of the house that Thomas had built, and that she had maintained alone through grief and through land disputes and through cold winters, and she thought that the house felt different than it had for a long time. Not like Thomas was gone from it, because Thomas would always have been here, but like something new had also arrived. "Sit down," she said. "The soup is going to go cold." He sat down, and the smile on his face was the warmest thing in the room. They ate dinner in the way of two people who have said something significant and are now allowing it to settle around them without requiring immediate architecture. They talked about his cattle plans and her garden, and the news that Clara Hutchins's husband had finally come back from Wichita, which was a story with enough complexity to keep them occupied through the soup and the bread and the pie she had made, because she had known today was a day that warranted pie. When dinner was finished and the dishes were washed in the companionable way they had developed of doing that together without anyone assigning tasks, he said quietly, "What happens next?" She dried her hands on the cloth and looked at him. "What do you want to happen next?" "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to ask you properly and not as an assumption or a pressure. I am asking because I want to build something with you, not because the world expects it or because it is the next step in a sequence. I am asking because you are the person I want to be building with." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word again, not the second time, the first time. She thought about Mary's letter. She thought about Thomas and about Robert, who she had loved and who had loved her and who were gone in the way that people who are gone are simply gone, absorbed into the grief that had become part of her, permanent but no longer consuming. She thought about what she was choosing right now and felt the full weight and clarity of choosing it. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands, both of them, holding them in his in the simple, unperformative way that was essentially his character. No speech, no grand gesture, just his hands around hers and his eyes looking at her with everything he felt, and not a single thing concealed. "I will not make it easy all the time," she told him honestly. "I am not a simple person." "I know," he said. "I did not fall in love with a simple person. I fell in love with you." She squeezed his hands. Outside, the October wind was doing what October wind did in Kansas, moving through the world with no particular agenda, indifferent to the business of the people inside the houses, but making the windows rattle enough to remind you it was there. She was not afraid right now. She was going to be afraid sometimes. She was certain of that, because old wounds did not disappear, they simply became familiar. But right now, standing in her kitchen with his hands around hers, she was simply present in a way she had not been in a very long time. They were married in December, 4 days before Christmas, in the small church in Caldwell that smelled of pine boughs and candle wax. It was a small ceremony because both of them preferred it that way, practical rather than theatrical, with Clara Hutchins as witness and Elliot Marsh and his wife, and James Proctor and Alice, who had rebuilt their barn through the autumn with the community help that the frontier offered in times of loss, as the other guests. Mary could not come from St. Louis in December with the roads what they were, but she sent a letter and a quilt she had made herself, blue and white and carefully stitched, with a note inside that said simply, "I knew you would figure it out." The preacher read the words, and Susan and Daniel said what they were supposed to say, and when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Daniel looked at her first as if asking permission even now, which was entirely like him, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "You have been very patient," and kissed him herself. Clara Hutchins made a sound in the pew that was partly a sob and partly a victory crow. They drove home to Susan's property in the late afternoon, through the cold and quiet December landscape, the snow packed hard on the road, and the sky a clean pale gray, the kind of sky that held its snow still. He had moved his most essential belongings to her house and would manage his own land from there during the winter, making the longer decisions about the properties in the spring when the ground opened up again and practical planning became possible. The house was warm when they arrived, the fire having been banked before they left, and the room smelling of pine and beeswax candles she had set out for when they returned. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after they came in, looking at the familiar room that had been hers alone for so long, and Daniel stood beside her. "Does it feel different?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly. "Good different or uncertain different?" She looked around the kitchen, at the shelf with Mary's letter and the book of poems and the good practical pots on their hooks and the window above the sink through which she had watched him ride away that first afternoon in September, thinking she was watching to make sure he left. "Good different," she said. "Very good different." That winter was the kind of winter that made you grateful for walls and fire and company, the cold coming in with serious intent and staying well into March. But Susan found the long evenings different now, filled differently, with conversation and with reading aloud to each other from the poetry book and from the other books she owned, with the practical discussion of land and cattle and garden plans and finances, with the particular domestic warmth of two people who have chosen each other and find the choosing validated daily by small things. He snored slightly, which she had not known in advance and which she chose to find endearing rather than irritating, because at 32 she was old enough to pick her perspective. He was a morning person in a way that was initially alarming given that she was not, but he was also the kind of morning person who made coffee and brought it to her without commentary, which was the correct approach to the situation. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not often, about the war. He had been a boy in Virginia when the war ended, too young to fight but old enough to have seen things a boy should not see. She learned not to wake him in the middle of the nightmare, but to wait and then to simply be present when he surfaced from it. And that presence seemed to be enough, seemed to settle him back into the ordinary darkness of their bedroom without requiring anything elaborate from either of them. He learned that she sometimes went silent for hours, not out of unhappiness, but out of a particular kind of internal processing that she had been doing alone for so long that she sometimes forgot it was possible to do it in company. He learned to leave her to it without taking it personally, which was the exact right thing and harder for some people than it sounds. Spring of 1880 came in with warmth and the meadowlarks and the smell of the earth turning over, and the practical enormous business of everything needing to happen at once. They decided to consolidate the two properties, filing the necessary paperwork through Elliott Marsh to create a combined holding of 56 acres, which was a meaningful piece of ground by any measure. Daniel brought his small cattle herd, 12 animals, onto the combined land, and Susan's garden expanded to take advantage of the additional southern acres, where the soil was sandy and warm and good for the root vegetables she had always wanted to grow more of. James Proctor came by in April to help with the first cattle fence and stayed for lunch and told Daniel with the frankness of a man who had been paying attention since September of 1878 that he was glad Susan had found someone worth having, and Daniel said he thought it was more that Susan had decided he was worth having, and that the distinction mattered. And James looked at him with the respect one man gives another who has clearly understood something important. In the summer of 1880, Susan learned she was pregnant. She sat with the information for 2 days before she told Daniel, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she was uncertain about her own feelings about it and needed to understand them before she introduced them to a conversation. She was 30 years old, by the standards of the time, a reasonable age for a first pregnancy, but not a casual one. She had not expected it to happen, had told herself she was not going to add children to the catalog of things she could lose, had constructed that particular defiance along with all the others. And yet here she was, sitting at the kitchen table with the knowledge settling into her like water into dry ground, soaking in rather than running off. She felt afraid. She felt something else that took longer to name, something quieter and more fundamental than either fear or excitement. She felt, after turning it over carefully, like something that had been waiting without her permission for a very long time. She told Daniel on a Tuesday evening after dinner, while they were sitting on the porch in the warm evening, the fireflies just beginning their work in the long grass near the creek. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face go through several things before it settled. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and it was specifically about her, specifically asking for her experience rather than projecting his own, which was entirely like him and was, every time, one of the reasons she loved him. "Afraid," she said honestly, "and also something I cannot fully name yet." "What does the something feel like?" She thought about it. "Like being ready for something without knowing you were waiting for it," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had that first time along the creek, and held it. "I am going to be here," he said, "every single step of it." "I know," she said, and she did know, completely and without reservation, which was its own kind of revelation for a woman who had once thought she would never trust anything completely again. The pregnancy was hard through the summer, the heat, and the nausea, and the particular indignity of a body making enormous demands while simultaneously expecting you to keep running a homestead. Daniel did more than his share without making a show of doing so, simply absorbing into his daily work the things that she could not manage at full capacity, and when she was frustrated by her own limitations, which happened more than she would have preferred, he did not make false reassurances but simply sat with her in the frustration until it passed. Clara Hutchins became an invaluable resource, having delivered approximately half the babies in the county at various points, and possessing a knowledge of pregnancy and birth that was considerably more practical than any book Susan had read. She came by regularly and gave advice and made teas from the herbs she grew, and was absolutely unafraid of any subject, which Susan found refreshing. In February of 1881, on a cold, still night when the snow was deep outside, and the fire in the bedroom was burning well, and Daniel was pacing the floor with an anxiety he was not quite managing to conceal, Susan gave birth to a son. He was loud about arriving, which Clara said was an excellent sign, and he was healthy and dark-haired like his father, and possessed from the very first moment of a gravity of expression that made Susan laugh through her exhaustion when she first held him. "He looks like he is already thinking about something," she said. "He gets that from you," Daniel said, sitting beside the bed and looking at the baby with an expression that Susan stored away carefully in her memory, because she wanted to remember it exactly. They named him Thomas Daniel Vaughn, Thomas for the man who had built this house and who had been good and was gone, and Daniel for his father, and they called him Tom from the first week because the full name was too solemn for an infant. The house was full in a way it had never been. Full of noise and need and the particular consuming exhaustion of new parenthood, and also full of something Susan had not quite known how to want, the ordinary daily warmth of a family. Not a perfect arrangement, not an easy one. Tom had opinions about sleeping that differed significantly from his parents' opinions about sleeping, and the spring was hard in the way that all springs were hard when there was land to work, and an infant who did not recognize the concept of convenient timing. But Daniel was there, completely and consistently, in the way he had promised to be. He walked Tom in the evenings when the baby was restless and Susan needed to sleep, pacing the kitchen floor in the lamplight, and speaking softly about the land and the cattle and the plans he had for the north pasture, as if preparing his son for a future interest in agriculture. Susan watched him do this through the bedroom doorway one evening when she was supposed to be sleeping and found she could not. She watched her husband walk their son in the kitchen of the house that Thomas had built, and that she had maintained alone through 2 years of grief and loss and careful closed-heartedness, and she thought about the conversation on the road in October of 1878, about first times and second times, about the particular logic of something new. She thought Daniel had been right. Not in a way that diminished anything that had come before, not in a way that made Thomas or Robert less real or less meaningful, but in the way that something genuinely new is actually new. She had not loved before in the way she loved now, complicated and clear-eyed, and built from the ground up with someone who knew exactly what he was getting and had chosen it deliberately. And the love had not diminished her capacity for grief. It had simply joined it, the way a new river joins an old one, and both continue. She went back to bed and slept, and in the morning Daniel brought her coffee before Tom woke up, in the quiet of the early light, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, "How are you?" In the specific way he always asked it, meaning not the polite version but the real version. "I am good," she said, and it was true in every sense she knew how to mean it. The years moved the way years do when the living of them is full and purposeful, quickly and slowly at the same time, marked by seasons and by the growth of things both planted and unplanted. Tom grew out of infancy into a small, determined person with his father's steadiness and his mother's specific way of observing the world, sitting still and watching carefully before he committed to any conclusion. He was 4 years old when his sister arrived, a girl they named Clara for their neighbor and Mary for Susan's sister, who had finally made the trip from St. Louis the previous autumn and had spent 3 weeks on the homestead, and had cried at the supper table the first evening simply from the relief of seeing Susan well and happy, and at home in the life she had built. Mary had liked Daniel immediately, and with an enthusiasm she did not moderate. She had looked at him across the supper table and said, without apparent embarrassment, "You are exactly right for her." And Daniel had said, "I know that I am trying very hard to be." And Mary had looked at Susan with an expression that said, "I told you so," without using any of those words. Little Clara was nothing like Tom in temperament, arriving in the world with considerable enthusiasm and opinions about everything that she expressed loudly and immediately from the first week. She laughed early and often, and had Susan's dark eyes and a curiosity about all things that expressed itself in a great deal of movement and noise. Susan was 34 when Clara was born, healthy and strong and entirely convinced by now that her capacity for love was not a fixed thing that depleted with use, as she had once feared, but something more like a spring, replenishing from somewhere underneath. The homestead was flourishing by 1884. They had 40 head of cattle, a full kitchen garden, a proper barn that Daniel had built with James Proctor's help over the summer of 1881, and land that was producing what land produces when it is worked with knowledge and patience. They had added a room to the house, a proper room for the children, because the 2-room arrangement that had suited Thomas when he built it had become insufficient for a household with 2 children and their attendant belongings. Daniel had become something of a resource in the community for questions about cattle management and land drainage, and Susan had become known as someone who could be relied upon when a neighbor was in difficulty, both things that suited their respective characters. They sat on the porch on summer evenings while Tom and Clara played in the yard, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the cattle prices in Wichita, and the book Susan was reading, and the news that came from St. Louis with Mary's letters and the plans for the North Pasture, and the question of whether Tom was showing the agricultural interest that Daniel had predicted in those late-night kitchen conversations. He was not. Tom, at 7, had displayed a passionate interest in birds, specifically in the taxonomy and behavior of the prairie birds that populated their world, and he carried a worn notebook everywhere and drew pictures of everything he saw with a diligence that was both touching and slightly concerning to his father, who had hoped for someone to inherit his opinions on cattle fencing. He might come around to the cattle, Susan said, watching Tom lie in the grass on his stomach watching a meadowlark with the focused attention of a naturalist. He might, Daniel agreed, without apparent distress. He had learned from Susan that people were most reliably themselves, and that this was not a problem to be solved. Clara, at 3, had already demonstrated a decisive interest in the horses, which was both appropriate and concerning given her size, and spent considerable time in the barn in conversation with the 2 draft horses that Daniel had bought the previous year. She talked to them with the confident authority of someone who expected to be understood and possibly was. "She is going to be a problem," Daniel observed one evening, watching Clara attempt to feed the larger draft horse a handful of prairie grass while standing on a bucket to reach. "She is going to be magnificent," Susan corrected. He looked at her and smiled, and she looked back, and between them was the accumulated weight of years of choosing each other through the practical and difficult business of actual living, which was heavier and more durable than anything said on any porch or in any kitchen in the beginning, before life had had time to test it. In the spring of 1885, on a warm evening in April when the prairie was green and the creek was running full from the snowmelt, and the meadowlarks were everywhere with their particular joy, Susan was standing in the garden with her hands in the soil, working around the early onion seedlings, when Daniel came through the gate from the cattle field. He had been checking the fence line along the southern pasture, an ordinary afternoon task, and he came through the gate and walked toward her, and she looked up from the garden at him, this man who was 40 years old now and broader through the shoulders than when she had met him and had the beginning of gray at his temples, and she thought about the day she had told him she was not built for this again. She had been wrong. Not because she had been foolish or weak, not because the reasons she had given herself were false, but because she had been thinking about love as a thing with a finite structure that repeated its own pattern, and it had turned out to be something more variable than that, more adaptable, more willing to be something new. He came to the edge of the garden and looked at what she was doing, and she looked up at him from the ground, and the evening light was the long, warm gold of Kansas in April, and Tom was somewhere on the property with his notebook, and Clara was in the barn with the horses, and the world was not perfect and was not simple and was not without its difficulties, but it was full and true and theirs. "How is the fence?" she asked. "Good," he said. "The post in the southwest corner needs resetting come dry weather, but otherwise solid. I will add it to the list." He crouched down at the edge of the garden, forearms on his knees, and looked at the onion seedlings with the same attention he gave everything. "These are coming in well. Better than last year," she said. "I adjusted how deep I was setting them." They talked about the onions and the fence and the plans for the weekend, which included a trip into Caldwell because Tom needed new boots, and Clara had asked with great urgency whether she might also get new boots, and Susan had said they would see, which Clara had interpreted as yes. After a while Daniel said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him. He asked this periodically, not as an anxiety but as a genuine check, as something he considered worth knowing rather than assuming. She appreciated it every time. She thought about the question in the way she always thought about it, not looking for the ideal answer but for the true one. She thought about the woman she had been in September of 1878, standing at a crooked gate with pliers in her hand and grief worn into her like a path worn into grass, certain in her bones that she was done with love, and meaning it fully. She thought about what it had cost to change that certainty, not because anyone had forced her to, but because something in her had been honest enough eventually to recognize the difference between the protection she needed and the prison she was building. She thought about Daniel, who had asked for the first time when she told him she was not built for the second time, who had understood that the only thing worth asking for was the thing that had never existed before. "Yes," she said clearly, "I am happy." He looked at her steadily, and the warmth in his expression was the kind that had nothing to prove and no performance in it, the kind that had been built over years of ordinary days and difficult seasons and choices made and remade every morning. "Good," he said simply, and straightened up from his crouch and went to help with the garden because there was still work to do, and that was the thing about the life they had built. There was always still work to do, and they did it together, which was the whole of the point. Clara came running from the barn at that moment with her dress dirty, and her hair loose from its braid, and her face flushed with the particular enthusiasm she brought to everything, shouting that one of the draft horses had let her comb his mane, which she apparently considered a significant diplomatic achievement. Tom appeared from the east side of the property, a few minutes later with his notebook clutched to his chest, and the information that he had seen a Swainson's hawk, which was an unusual sighting this early in the season. Susan stood up from the garden and dusted the earth from her hands and looked at her children running toward her across the green April prairie, and at her husband turning from the garden to intercept Clara before she could trample the onion seedlings, and at the house behind them with its smoke from the supper fire and its new room and its windows that had watched so much come and go. She thought about Thomas, who had built this house with his hands. She thought about Robert, who had been her first, the one who had taught her what it was to open. She carried them both, in the place where grief becomes permanent and quiet, no longer an emergency but a presence. And she thought about Daniel Vaughn, who had ridden through her gate in the September dust and told her the truth when he did not have to, and who had said, "I am asking for the first time," as if he understood that the whole point was to begin something that had never been before. He caught Clara around the waist before she reached the onions and spun her up off the ground, which produced from Clara a sound of pure delight that scattered the meadowlarks from the fence posts. And Tom arrived at Susan's side and looked at the onion seedlings and said they were coming in better than last year, and she said she had adjusted how deep she set them, and Tom wrote this down in his notebook with the seriousness of a person preserving important scientific data. And the April evening held all of them in its long, warm light, golden and unhurried, and the prairie stretched away in every direction the way it always had, wide and permanent and indifferent to grief and alive to everything, and Susan Yates Vaughn stood in her garden in the middle of it and knew herself for what she was, built, after all, for this, built for exactly this.